Welcome to the Gluck Solution Podcast. I am Dr. Errol Gluck, executive life coach, professional hypnotist, and master problem solver. Today, we're here with Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez, an alternative cancer doctor who has been targeting cancer in an unorthodox and controversial way. His method, called the Gonzalez Regimen, uses supplements, nutritional planning, and even coffee enemas to combat the toxins involved with many types of cancer. With a clinical study on his side, proven cases, and a whole lot of detractors, we welcome Dr. Gonzalez. Thank you for being here. Now, for our first question, it sounds crazy, but curing cancer with vegetables and coffee. But it's obvious that's something you're really devoted to in your whole life. So could you explain what you believe in, and could you explain what is the Gonzalez Regimen?
The treatment involves three basic components: individualized diet, individualized supplement regimens with large doses of pancreatic enzymes, and the third component would be the detoxification routines to which you referred, such as the coffee enemas. Now, in our practice, we don't have just one diet. A lot of alternative practitioners prescribe one diet. Ornish, Pritikin believe everyone's a vegetarian. Atkins believed everyone should be eating red meat. We have 10 basic diets. They range from largely plant-based fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and grains to an Atkins-type diet where people are eating red meat 2 or 3 times a day. We have 90 variations of diet. Second component, individualized supplement regimens. Each patient gets a supplement regimen designed for their particular metabolic needs. And the supplement regimens vary enormously from the amount of supplements, the type of vitamins, minerals, the forms. In addition, for cancer, we prescribe large doses of specially designed pancreatic enzymes derived from a pig or a lamb source. We believe the vitamins, minerals, trace elements provide a supportive type of nutrition, but they really don't attack cancer cells. We believe pancreatic enzymes are the main anti-cancer component of our practice, based on the work of the British scientist Dr. John Beard, who 100 years ago first suggested that pancreatic enzymes have an anti-cancer effect. In orthodox physiology, pancreatic enzymes are known to be digestive enzymes. They were first identified in 1858. We've known about them for 160 years. Beard suggested in 1902 that in addition to their digestive capability, they have an anti-cancer effect. The third component, which also is probably the most controversial, of the detoxification routines. They're really quite simple. These are just procedures that we find help the body mobilize and neutralize and excrete the toxic debris that form when the body repairs and when tumors break down. When the body is going through a nutritional repair process, it releases all kinds of stored toxins like heavy metals, pesticides, hydrocarbons. And tumors are very abnormal, and tumor cells produce all kinds of molecules and proteins and enzymes that are foreign and toxic to normal, healthy tissue. So when the enzymes start breaking down a tumor, which is wonderful and terrific, you get all this toxic debris that can be quite poisonous. Things like the coffee enemas help the liver mobilize, neutralize these toxins. Now, the coffee enemas, as controversial as they are, actually come out of the mainstream medical literature. They were in the Merck Manual, which is a textbook of conventional medicine right up until 1977. What's
the science behind the coffee enemas?
It's believed when you take coffee rectally as opposed to when you drink it. When you take it rectally, the caffeine stimulates a bunch of nerves located in the lower bowel, technically called the sacral parasympathetic nerves. And when they're turned on by the caffeine through a spinal reflex, they stimulate both phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification systems in the liver. So they basically help the liver work more efficiently. The liver is the body's main detoxification organ. When the liver works better, the patients can tolerate breaking down a tumor, which is a very toxic process. So they work through a neurological reflex.
So why coffee and not Coca-Cola?
Well, caffeine will work. It's a good question because Coca-Cola has caffeine, and actually Coca-Cola would work. There was a study in 1929, actually performed at Lenox Hill Hospital, published in a mainstream peer-reviewed journal, where they used a variety of substances rectally that actually worked, and they did radiographic studies to show the liver and the gallbladder would start stumping their waste in response to even milk. We find coffee works most efficiently because in addition to the caffeine, there are dozens of cofactors that are not found in other foods that seem to help the caffeine work most efficiently. So while indeed you could use Coca-Cola because it does have caffeine, coffee first doesn't have the toxic junk or the sugar, but it also has cofactors that seem to work most efficiently.
You explained it quite well. One thing that I'm intrigued in your work is the importance of diet. And I do think the medical establishment doesn't take it quite serious. Even though diet and nutrition are responsible for most people's health, why do you believe that the medical establishment doesn't give diet and nutrition the place it deserves?
When I was in medical school at Cornell, we had about 6 hours devoted to nutrition the entire 4 years, and that was optional. That was an elective course. There was no required work in nutrition at all, but we had hundreds of hours devoted to pharmacology. And then, the young medical school students, they come out of medical school totally indoctrinated that the only way to beat disease is through the inventions of the mind, the human mind, the technological innovations like radiation or pharmacology. It's actually an indoctrination process where you are taught that the only way we can deal with disease is through the inventions of the human mind, which translates into pharmacology or radiology or targeted therapies or these kind of pharmacological inventions. The idea that something as simple as nutrition or vitamins and minerals, trace elements might have a positive effect not only on general health but on disease is so foreign to the thinking and to the model with which medical students are indoctrinated, they just can't accept it. It's so foreign to their training, they just don't understand it. It's like asking someone to talk about the landscape of Pluto. They're not taught it. They don't understand. In fact, they're taught the opposite. They're taught that only pharmacological interventions or similar things can be useful against the diseases which ravages the human species.
In your treatment, is it preventative as well? If people followed the Gonzalez Regimen, would it prevent cancer from forming?
Well, we believe so. We treat a lot of advanced cancer successfully, but we also use it for preventative reasons. I follow it myself. I've been on it for 31 years since I first learned about this treatment, and I believe fully that I couldn't work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, decade. Now it's getting to be decades, hard to believe. If I weren't on my program, I'd have long ago been dead. We have a very high-stress practice. We're dealing with a lot of very sick patients with multiple medical problems that require intensive monitoring. And I have to be in top shape. I follow my own program, live by my own rules. Never trust a doctor that doesn't live by his own rules. My colleague Isaacs and I, we live by our rules, and I find it's really extraordinary in terms of prevention. We have patients, often the spouses of successfully treated cancer patients get interested, go on the program, and invariably they'll report that their health is so much better than it had been before. So yes, it does have a good preventative effect. We believe pancreatic enzymes not only treat cancer effectively, but are useful preventatively. I take them myself for preventative reasons.
Are there any studies that actually show if the Gonzalez Regimen, if taken, will reduce the incidence of cancer?
Well, there are no epidemiological studies to that effect. There are studies going back 100 years showing pancreatic enzymes have an anti-cancer effect. For example, Dr. Beard, who first suggested pancreatic enzymes have an anti-cancer effect, was a full professor at the University of Edinburgh and actually was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 1906 for his embryology research. And he did animal studies. We think of 100 years ago as a primitive time in science, but they were very sophisticated in the major academic centers. And he tested his enzyme thesis in animals with great success as well as in patients with great success, all documented in the mainstream peer-reviewed medical literature. But unfortunately, Madame Curie at the same time announced to the world that radiation was a simple, easy cure for all cancer, and Beard was this nerdy ivory tower scientist. Madame Curie was very media savvy. Beard was forgotten. When he died in 1924, he was forgotten. The work was revived, as you know, by Dr. Kelly during the 60s and 70s. There were studies in the 1960s in animal models by reputed academic scientists showing pancreatic enzymes indeed have an anti-cancer effect. And Leighton King did a series of studies in a mouse model where he showed they not only treat cancer effectively, but they have a preventative effect in animals. We've done both human clinical studies as well as animal studies, Nestle-funded animal studies.
But here's what I don't understand. Everyone's fear is to get cancer. The C word causes people to move from one house to another. If the Gonzalez Regimen actually prevents cancer, why not insist on studies to be done so that cancer itself doesn't manifest as often as it does?
Well, we insisted on studies be done. In fact, we did a pilot study that was suggested by the NCI and supervised by the National Cancer Institute and funded by Nestle. This was published in 1999. Now, it was a phase 2 study. In phase 2 studies, you don't have a control group. Phase 2 studies or pilot studies are basically preliminary studies to show whether new treatment has some efficacy against a disease for which there is no known mainstream therapy that works. And we got the greatest results in the history of medicine with advanced pancreatic cancer. So we did publish a clinical study showing the effect. Then we did animal studies under the direction of Nestle. They were done at the University of Nebraska, which has a very good research division in pancreatic cancer specifically, and they've developed animal models. We used it in animal models.
Are there other practitioners around the world who is using the Gonzalez Regimen?
No, it's just Dr. Isaacs and I, though there are other practitioners that over the last 100 years have used pancreatic enzymes.
So people have read these studies, and no one has decided to try out these studies to see if they could, in fact, have more success in preventing cancer. Why is that?
you're asking me to explain the psychology of other people. I think in my own profession in oncology and conventional oncology, the oncologists are so tied into chemotherapy and radiation. They just, as I was talking about earlier, they're so indoctrinated to think only drugs and drug interventions can be useful against such a terrible disease. I don't even think it enters their consciousness. When our pilot study was published in 1999 in a peer-reviewed journal, in a very well-respected research journal, it elicited virtually minimal interest in the academic community, though there was a lot of interest among lay people and people with cancer. There were colleagues that said it just can't be true, therefore there must be something wrong in the study. The study was supervised by eminent academicians. It was done impeccably. No one's been able to discredit the data. But there was almost a universal either silence about it or the basic exclamation that this can't possibly be true because we know nutrition. They had the hypothesis that nutrition could not be useful against cancer in general, specifically, particularly against an aggressive cancer like pancreatic. Therefore, because it couldn't be true, it can't be true, which is an unscientific approach.
This is what confuses me. I've heard you say several times that doctors have been indoctrinated, but I break the world down very simply into two types of people: hedonists and moral hedonists. Hedonists just live for pleasure. Moral hedonists live for pleasure that provides some good to other people. If a doctor coming into medicine all around the world, wouldn't they want to be recognized? Wouldn't they want to be the one who identifies something that is going to make not only them famous, but give them a chance to heal so many people?
Well, one of the suggestions with what you say is that you say, wouldn't they want to be the one to discover? Well, it's already been discovered. Beard already discovered it. Beard should have won the Nobel Prize for his discovery. So there's no glory or ego gratification in confirming what someone else did. I don't have that kind of ego. I was very happy to show that Beard was correct and that Kelly after him was correct in the use of pancreatic enzymes. It's not my therapy. I'm just standing on the shoulders of people who went before with much greater genius than I have. And what they did was correct. I think oncologists, again, I use the word indoctrinated, but they have their careers. What I do is so foreign to what they do, they couldn't come to a seminar on Saturday and start using it on Monday. I lived in Kelly's house over a period of 5 years for 2 years. I watched him work with patients. They would have to unlearn all their traditional academic oncology and learn a completely new method of intervention that involves nutrition and coffee enemas, things they've never been trained in. So they're not qualified to do it because they haven't been trained in it. It's not their fault. They haven't been trained in it. And as far as helping people, I've been in the medical world now. I started medical school in 1979. I mean, as I've discussed in my book, What Went Wrong, there are so many instances of academic fraud at the highest levels of the academic community. It's almost sickening that people at the highest levels of the academic world, who should be most concerned about truth, scientific integrity, justice, concern for patients, compassion, could care less to the point it becomes about ego gratification, fame, glory. And they want to be the one that finds the answer to cancer. They don't want some guy who uses coffee enemas or Dr. Beard 100 years ago to have had the answer. What glory does that bring them? So I think in terms of ego satisfaction, there is none in proving somebody else is smart.
I want to switch subjects for a second. I want to talk about the quality of life when a person has cancer. Now, chemotherapy is dreaded because of fatigue, the nausea, the dizziness. In your treatment, it appears that patients have to take somewhere between 150, 200 pills a day. How do they deal with that?
It's not that difficult. It's really a question of mindset. If somebody thinks drinking carrot juice and eating organic salads is terrible torture and taking pills, they're not going to be suited for this program. We admit that right out front. But I take about 100 pills a day myself, and you just get used to it. It takes 10 minutes to take the pills. It's not that difficult, and they're spread through the day. It's not as if they take them at once. Compared to something like I was trained to do bone marrow transplants, which is very intensive academic oncology. Compared to something like a bone marrow transplant where you bring people to the edge of death and try and salvage them, taking 200 pills a day to me is like baby work. I don't find it difficult. On the other hand, if somebody doesn't want to give up smoking, doesn't want to give up drinking, likes eating junk food, doesn't mind being 300 pounds, they're not going to be suited for my program right out front. This isn't for everybody. This is for people who are willing to take charge of their life, take responsibility for their life, and willing to do the work. Maintaining good health, as you know, always involves work. It involves exercise, making smart dietary choices, and in our case, taking supplements. But taking supplements isn't some ungodly torture. It's not that difficult, unless someone's mindset is absolutely adamantly against it.
What would you say to a doctor who embraces both alternative and traditional ways of fighting cancer?
I think it's terrific. I think the more the mind is open, the better for everybody, patients and the profession as well. I think it's terrific. So I'm glad that there are oncologists in this day and age, increasingly so, who don't scoff immediately at alternative medicine in general or therapy in specific, but are getting interested in incorporating nutritional approaches into their practice. I think it's terrific, and I encourage that.
So in your practice, do you ever encourage non-traditional or traditional medicine?
We always do what's best for the patient. For example, we routinely, almost every day, we have a patient contact us who wants to become our patient, and they have breast cancer, a lump in their breast, it hasn't spread, and they don't want their breast to be touched. They don't want surgery. They want to come get the magical Gonzalez therapy. We turn those patients down, and we're very gentle, and we explain that surgery could, if it's localized breast cancer, surgery can be curative 80 to 90% of the time. So we will send them off to do conventional therapy, sometimes to their great annoyance. I had a chiropractor call me a couple of years ago, was diagnosed with stage 1 Hodgkin's disease. Well, stage 1 Hodgkin's disease is one of the great successes in conventional oncology. 80 to 90% of patients with stage 1, stage 2 Hodgkin's can be cured with chemo. Yeah, there are downsides and there are side effects. I explained this to the chiropractor, and he was aghast that Dr. Gonzalez, this great alternative physician, was suggesting that he think about chemo. Well, he eventually did chemo, and about a year later wrote me a note and said he was considered cured, and he was grateful that I insisted he get chemo. So the answer is we're not running a cult. Our goal is to do the best for patients, and sometimes doing the best for the patient is not to do our treatment. And we explain that to patients on a weekly, sometimes even a daily basis. We do what's best for the patient, whether it's our therapy, conventional, or some combination thereof.
I want to talk a little bit about your biography. Now, it appears you started out in English, and so tell me, how did you go from Charelle to cancer?
Yeah, that's a good question. My goal in life when I was in college was to be Ernest Hemingway. I wanted to be a writer. I went to Brown University, which has no required courses. I chose Brown because there were no required courses. I didn't have to take awful science, which I thought was the most oppressive subject a human being could possibly study. And literature was emancipating and liberating, all of those things. And I worked as a journalist. My first job after college was at Time, and I got to do the things that journalists do, travel, meet interesting people. Well, as a result of my work as a journalist, one of my editors suggested that I do some investigative medical writing. I said, what are you, crazy? Medicine is the dullest subject you could possibly want to do. Wars, politics, political upheavals, not medicine. But I took the challenge, and I wrote a story on cancer research that actually won an award. And I got to meet some really bright researchers and realized that these people were as creative as any novelist, and these were devoted to science, and these people at the highest levels. There are scientists devoted to truth, devoted to helping humanity. Just noble people. And it was really very moving. And some of them became friends, and they challenged me. They said, why don't you go to medical school? Stop diddling around in journalism. So I took the challenge. Of course, I had no science courses. I had to go back to Columbia, do my pre-med work, and then apply to medical. Loved it, never regretted it, and that's how it happened. It was really based on a series of articles I wrote on medicine that got me really interested in medical research. That's how it happened.
What organizations and individuals over the years have actually supported your work?
Well, Procter & Gamble, which is a very blue-collar, blue mainstream company, supported our work from 1995, 1998. They put several $1 million into background research, for which I'm grateful. And the chief of research, J.P. Jones, at the time, now retired, remains a very close friend. And they helped us perfect the method for making our pancreatic enzymes, which are made specially for us. Nestle's been supporting our work since 1992, not in recent years, but they financed the first pilot study, and they financed the animal studies that were done at the University of Nebraska.
Nestle makes chocolate. Do they also include that with the enema?
Look, Nestle makes 16,000 products, and I will be very honest. And they know I don't eat any of their products because I live by my rules. The chief of research at Nestle, Pierre Gassery, was formerly medical director of the Pasteur Institute, a very eminent physician researcher. And Nestle hired him to look into innovative healthcare issues. And they started looking into my work because of Gassery's okay, and that's how they supported our work. But I agree with you. Nestle's would be an odd company to support our work, although they did want to help develop my work, and they had a business plan. But I felt that wasn't the right company for my work eventually, so we eventually parted company, although they made a very lucrative offer to continue their development. The National Cancer Institute, as you know, did support our second clinical study that unfortunately was not successfully managed and didn't have a successful outcome. It was just kind of a catastrophe. So we've been supported by Nestle's, Procter & Gamble, and the National Cancer Institute.
Something closer to home. In 1996, my first wife, Lenore, was diagnosed with advanced stage 4 breast cancer. She was given approximately 3 to 4 months to live. We turned down treatment. We decided to just go and enjoy life. And 5 years later, with no sickness, with her never getting sick, literally a day in her life, she eventually died. What success rate do you have with stage 4 breast cancer, and what would you have done different? What do you think I should have done different?
Well, I think I don't tell people what they should do. I think everybody should make their own decisions, and I respect patients' decisions. I respect patients that don't want to do my therapy. When someone has cancer, the entire family's involved, as you know so well, because you lived through it. And the worst thing a doctor can do is take on the role of the dictator. We offer advice. We offer our therapy if people want it. If they don't want to do it, that's fine. So I wouldn't say you should have done something else or should have seen me or whatever. First 5 years with stage 4 breast cancer is already a remarkable survival. We get most of our patients, we have probably 350 patients with breast cancer in our practice active at present. The majority have advanced disease, and the majority, well over 50%, are doing well. Up to my longest survivor now is from when I first started 25 years ago. She had stage 4 disease that failed chemo with metastases in the bone. They gave her up as hopeless, came to see me. She actually developed metastatic disease while getting aggressive chemo in 1986, came to see me in 1987. Was one of my first patients. Within several years, all her bones were clear. She continues to follow my regimen today. That's, in December, it'll be 25 years, so it's about 24 and a half years. So we have patients like that, well-documented, biopsy-proven, treated in the conventional fashion, and failed traditional therapies have been with us in excess of 20 years with stage 4 breast cancer. So we have many, many patients like that have now been with me in excess of 2 decades.
So do we have documentation in terms of women with breast cancer, how they would do stage 4 with you versus Sloan Kettering?
Well, in the conventional medical world, stage 4 breast cancer, if one reads the textbooks, even today in 2012 is considered incurable. In fact, DaVita, the classic textbook, Principles and Practices of Oncology, it's the standard, and I have all editions on my shelf. They still say in 2012 that metastatic breast cancer ultimately is incurable. With some of the new treatments, they can get prolongation of life, even occasional long-term survivors. Your wife was an unusual survivor without any standard therapy. But eventually, women, they will die. In our case, we have patients that have been living with us for 20 years. Now, what we're doing right now is our next book is going to be a series of 120 case reports. I've already written up about 25 breast cancer patients, all properly diagnosed, biopsy-proven at major institutions, who have enjoyed extraordinary long-term survival and in most cases regression of extensive disease while just following our regimen. And we're documenting that with medical records with the identifying information redacted for the protection of their privacy. So people will be able to see what we can do. And what we're going to do in the introduction is make a gentlemanly challenge to Sloan Kettering or any other group of oncologists to match the cases. It would be an interesting event. So we think they should match it. It'd be great to see whether they can. I suspect they won't be able to do that. But we are looking specifically at our success with metastatic breast cancer. You brought that up, and coincidentally, we are looking at that. We've already written up a whole series of our patients.
Normally, when one thing is invented in one country, we see it popping up in different countries all over the world almost simultaneously. Why do you believe more people have not stumbled on to what you have stumbled onto?
Well, I think other people have. I mean, there was for example, Frank Shively was a surgeon in the 1960s in Dayton, Ohio, who rediscovered Beard's work and began using pancreatic enzymes with great success. He was kind of in isolation. He wasn't an academician, and his work was kind of forgotten too. So other people have discovered. In Germany, pancreatic enzymes are routinely used along with their cancer protocols. They have that enzyme, Wolb enzyme, that has been used in Germany as part of their cancer protocol. So it's more accepted in certain European countries. So I can't say that it hasn't been used or tried. Wolf and Ramsberger were two researchers who rediscovered Beard's work independently of me or Kelly, and in Germany developed their enzyme, and their company produced this pancreatic enzyme that is used throughout Europe in cancer protocols. So other people have stumbled upon Beard's work, have confirmed it in animal studies and in clinical studies, and are using them. So I'm not the only person using pancreatic enzymes.
You've gone on record saying a very, very interesting thing. When conventional treatment fails, their doctors are lauded as heroes. But when alternative treatment fails, they're doctored or maligned. First question is when conventional treatment fails, why are their doctors lauded as heroes? Normally people don't applaud their doctor when their spouses die.
Well, Sloan Kettering, I went to medical school at Cornell because it was affiliated with Sloan Kettering. I did my third year medical clerkship at Memorial Hospital. And each room has a plaque in honor of. And the residents used to laugh and call it the Grateful Dead, because they're all dead and they're all family members donating money to Sloan Kettering. Sloan Kettering is the most highly endowed hospital in the world, with an endowment in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and most of it's from the families of dead patients, because they're so grateful that these heroic doctors at Sloan Kettering tried so hard. The fact that the patient died almost seems irrelevant. They laud the patient. A perfect example of that is Michael Landon, who died in around 1991 from stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Now, he actually came to see me but never did the therapy, and it's not a secret, so I'm not breaking confidentiality. He said that he would see me. But he wasn't going to do my program. He decided to do chemotherapy at Cedars-Sinai. He was dead within 3 months. He died a miserable death. His publicist Harry Flynn became a very close personal friend, so I saw what happened. Through his publicist wanted him to come see me, but Michael wouldn't do it. He died a very miserable death on aggressive chemo. His widow, Cindy Landon, was so grateful to the oncologist in charge that I understand, according to Harry, she gave Cedars-Sinai and that oncologist $30 million, and he died. But she was so grateful for all the care and how heroic they were. $30 million. Now, another example of how the way the press approaches alternative practitioners, and my mentor Kelly treated Steve McQueen back in 1980, and the great actor, and he eventually died. Now, he has mesothelioma, and to this day, 30 years later, for example, 2 years ago, there was a doctor up at Harvard wrote an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal blaming Kelly for killing Steve McQueen. It was like he murdered Steve McQueen. Well, Steve McQueen had mesothelioma, which even today, 30 years later, is completely incurable in the conventional medical world. The story about McQueen has never been completely told. He was misdiagnosed by his fancy doctors at Cedars-Sinai for a year. They were treating him for a cold when he had mesothelioma. By the time it was diagnosed, it was already metastasized. Then they give him radiation, which is worthless with mesothelioma. Then they gave him immunotherapy, which did nothing. When he was dying, then he went to see Kelly. And I told Kelly he made one mistake. He should never have taken McQueen as a patient. He was too erratic, didn't comply, continued to drink and smoke. But he still lasted longer than he should have and died. In the press reports, it's never mentioned that he was misdiagnosed by his conventional doctors, treated with worthless radiation, which no study has ever shown works for mesothelioma, then treated with immunotherapy, which no study in the history of medicine shows works for mesothelioma. Then he goes to see Kelly after all the conventional therapies have failed, and Kelly gets blamed as if he took a gun and shot him in the head. Even 30 years later, no conventional doctor goes through that. Celebrities die all the time. They die, Patrick Swayze's oncologist. They held a press conference. We're going to beat this thing. I read the interviews. I said, he's stage 4 pancreatic cancer. You're not going to beat this thing. The oncologist gives a press conference, say, we're going to really beat this thing. Well, they didn't beat this thing. He died after 15 months. He knew about me, didn't come. The oncologist wasn't blamed, didn't say you misled them. He was a fancy oncologist at Stanford. And I wouldn't be surprised if Swayze's widow gave Stanford a donation because she's so grateful at the special. Conventional oncologists are great at dealing with the families of celebrities. They court them. And when the patient dies, the hands are out for the donations, and usually they get it. And again, $30 million from the Landon family to Cedars-Sinai. And he died in 3 months. What is that to celebrate? But that's the way it is. Kelly tries hard with a conventional failure, and 30 years later, Kelly's dead. He still gets blamed as if he murdered McQueen. So that's a differential standard that's almost irrational.
Dr. Gonzalez, might one argue that there is more of a learning curve in modern medicine, that modern medicine does self-question and evolve, which it has evolved? Does alternative medicine have the same type of self-questioning? And has it evolved, and has your treatment evolved?
Well, that's a number of questions. First, it's a wonderful thought that conventional medicine would be self-correcting and self-learning and self-analyzing. Having been in the middle of the academic medical world at the highest levels, I would say that's a wonderful thought, but unfortunately usually not the case. A wonderful example of how medicine doesn't self-correct, doesn't learn, and could care less about learning is the bone marrow transplant and breast cancer fiasco. Long story, make it real short. 1988, oncologists began to suspect that with advanced breast cancer, bone marrow transplant would be a way of treating these patients in which you can use high-dose chemotherapy beyond what you normally could administer to a woman. Of course, with high-dose chemotherapy, the bone marrow fails, but then you salvage these women with a bone marrow transplant, and it was promoted as a wonderful way to treat advanced cancer. The problem was there was no documentation that it worked, but the oncology profession, as a profession, we're not talking about a few renegade oncologists, the entire profession mobilized, got Congress involved, 54 Congress people, issued a regulation insisting that insurance companies pay for this. The insurance companies balked because there was no evidence that it worked, and it cost up to $450,000. The oncologists mobilized the legal profession, began suing insurance companies, saying that insurance companies denying these victims, these helpless women with breast cancer, from this useful treatment, that even though there was no evidence that it worked. Finally, in 1995, after it became accepted therapy because of the mobilization of the oncology profession working with the media and fanatical trial lawyers, it was accepted standard of care. Insurance companies had to pay for it. And then the NCI, in its wisdom, decided maybe we should test it to see if it works. 5 studies were done. 4 showed it had no effect. 1 showed extraordinarily positive effects, but turned out to be completely fraudulent. And it took 6 years before that article was retracted in 2000. And here's a case. It wasn't a few isolated oncologists. It was the entire profession mobilizing in the absence of data to use a dangerous, toxic, deadly treatment that killed 10 to 30% of the women undergoing the procedure, in the absence of any data that showed it worked. And when it was finally tested, even though 4 studies were negative, the fraudulent study was so promoted they continued doing it for another 5 years until finally there were a few honest oncologists who said this is fraudulent. And the NCI actually resisted reviewing the one fraudulent study. Independent oncologists had to go to South Africa where the study was done at their own expense, and it cost a lot of money to fly to South Africa to review that article, and found that the data had been completely made up. So there's an example of a step therapy that killed people. 20 to 30% of the women died during the procedure. Went on for 12 years. The entire profession mobilized in its support. There was no self-analysis, no evaluation of data.
So, Dr. Gonzalez, do you believe that there is literally a conspiracy not to provide the patient with the best treatment, not to evaluate what works and doesn't work, not to give the client what they need and to learn from past mistakes, and to simply let people die just for money?
No, I don't think I think there was a financial thing, but there actually business were set up to offer bone marrow transplants like franchises. There were actually businesses set up like franchises. It's reprehensible. If an alternative practitioner did that, they'd be in jail. After the bone marrow transplant fiasco was finally totally discredited in 2001, oncologists, no one went to jail. No one was, the guy who published the fraudulent study lost his medical license in South Africa, but he didn't end up in jail. I think there's an example of oncologists as a group, as a profession. It wasn't just a few isolated oncologists, so fanatically believing that chemotherapy had to work that they actually were blinded to the negative data, refused to accept it. So there's an example where you have the exact opposite of people at the highest levels of the profession, even within the NIH and the NCI, refusing to accept that the model they believed in didn't work. So I think the idea that, and it went on for 12 years, it wasn't like 6 months, and it's estimated 40,000 women got this useful treatment. No one really knows how much, but at least 40,000 women underwent bone marrow transplant for breast cancer in the absence of any little legitimate data, and 10 to 20 to 30% of them died prematurely.
How does the alternative medicine world, how do they police themselves?
I think you have to police yourself as there are dishonest alternative practitioners. I run into them all the time. There are dishonest conventional physicians. I run into them all the time. I think ultimately... Is there an oversight board that looks at everyone? I think what happens, in the marketplace, if a therapy doesn't work, people begin to realize it doesn't work. And that's what happened with bone marrow transplant in the conventional oncology world. There are many, many unconventional alternative cancer therapies that I think are useless. I think a lot of them have been promoted unfairly. I think a lot of them have been promoted in books and in the media without any data to support their use. But eventually, in the marketplace, if you don't get good results, no one really has that much interest in it. There is no board to police. But my point about the bone marrow transplant studies, you can't depend on boards to police it, because where was the conventional oncology board? The American Society of Clinical Oncology embraced bone marrow transplant. The people that should have been regulating and overseeing scientific truth were so blinded by their belief this had to work. It was almost a mythical, mystic, psychological thing. They had to believe it worked, that they couldn't even police themselves. So I think, a pox on both your houses. I'll be the first one to say that there are unconventional alternative practices, like a lot of the hospitals in Mexico that I think are used. Some of the hospitals in Mexico I think are legitimate and doing good work. A lot of them are money-oriented. I know alternative practitioners that are greedy and oriented toward money, but I know oncologists that are greedy and oriented toward money as well. So I think it's a pox on both your houses. One of the problems is that insurance pays for most modern medicine, and I do not believe, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that insurance companies pay for the treatment that you offer and that many alternative
doctors offer, but I could be wrong. You could tell me.
That's true. By government regulations, insurance companies only have to pay for standard of care, and indeed alternative medicine is not standard of care. They do pay for acupuncture, massage therapy, some chiropractic. They certainly don't pay for what we do. And all the insurance companies know who I am, and they don't pay for it. So we try and keep the cost down as much as possible, but you're right, it's not covered by insurance.
So what happens if someone is being treated by you and they're in the middle of the regimen and something happens and they run out of money? What happens to them?
We keep treating them. I have patients I treat for free. I have charity patients. It's tough because, I don't have the government behind me, but we treat them for free. We don't turn a patient down because they can't pay the bill. We're owed tens of thousands. I hate to think, my accountant goes ballistic, how much money we're owed that we're never going to see. We just write it off and hope we survive. So no one's turned down because they can't afford it. I don't sell the supplements, but we've managed to get even the supplements for these patients for free at times if they can't pay for it. We're not going to let someone die if they can't pay for it. There have been cases where I paid for the supplements myself. I didn't tell the patient. I just did it. I said they're getting it for free, but I paid the check.
Could you explain the two major studies that have been conducted on the Gonzalez Regimen? How did they differ and who sponsored what?
The first study was the pilot study I mentioned earlier. It was first suggested by the National Cancer Institute in 1993 and was funded by Nestle, and it was overseen by Ernst Winder, who is now deceased, but one of the most prominent cancer epidemiologists who ever lived. He published the first study in 1950 proving that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. He worked at Sloan Kettering, had his own institute, American Health Foundation. He was in charge. There was an oncologist, Julian Hyman, who was also involved, and Pierre Guesry, who was at Nestle, former medical director of Pasteur, also involved as the oversight group, and there were also consultants. So it was supervised by a group of eminent academicians, funded by Nestle, supervised by the National Cancer Institute, and the results were published in 1999, again, with pancreatic cancer, showing the best results in the history of medicine. The second study, as a result of the first study, Richard Klausner in 1998, who was director of the National Cancer Institute, called me down to Washington. We met in the offices of Congressman Dan Burton, and he said based on the preliminary pilot study data, he was going to authorize a National Cancer Institute study, $1.4 million, to do a phase 3 study in which my therapy would be compared to the best available chemotherapy, again in patients with advanced pancreatic cancer. And initially, we had great enthusiasm for the study because Dr. Klausner seemed legitimately, honorably intending to do a really legitimate study. Unfortunately, Dr. Klausner left the NCI about a year later, and a new group came in who seemed to have a completely different motivation. And all the scientists at the NCI and the NIH who had initially been assigned to the study, who seemed legitimately interested in doing an honorable and honest study, were suddenly moved off. And a new group came in that we believe had marching orders to make sure that my work would never see the light of day. And from there on, the whole study began to deteriorate. It was eventually completed in 2005. We thought it was so poorly managed, we believe deliberately as well as just through carelessness, that we filed a complaint with the Office of Human Research Protections, which is an oversight group at the NIH. They conducted a 2-year investigation, put their results on their website, finding that the study had been completely mismanaged by the group at Columbia. As a result of that, the FDA, which has never been seen as a friend of alternative medicine, began its own investigation because the FDA had actually signed off on this study back in 1998. They conducted their own investigation, indeed found the group at Columbia hadn't followed the protocol, hadn't managed it properly. Unfortunately, there was no punishment for the investigators involved, but we're hoping that that will be rectified. We have our book out about the study, and where they talk about having congressional investigations into how $1.4 million was basically squandered on a study that didn't show legitimate data. So the second study really hasn't shown anything legitimate.
Most people believe that you follow the money and you follow that which is best. There are a tremendous amount of wealthy people out there who, just like the rest of us, get cancer, die from cancer. If this treatment works, why aren't more people following it, and why isn't it more popular?
Well, I don't know that it isn't popular. We get scores of requests a day, people wanting to become patients. We select our patients carefully from all over the world. We have patients from Israel to Singapore. Am I king of the world? No. But is it a popular therapy? Just through word of mouth. There's no greater advertisement than a successful patient.
Why aren't tens of thousands of doctors doing this?
You'd have to ask them. I don't know why.
Well, if it works and they are healing people, and we have people like Doctors Without Borders who sacrifice their lives and don't make a penny, why would not someone who's going to medical school, not for the guts and the glory, because there's no more money in medicine, Why aren't more people doing this type of treatment to heal people from a dreaded disease?
Just because they work for Doctors Without Borders doesn't mean they haven't accepted the medical model that drugs work best. In fact, Doctors Without Borders uses drugs to treat therapy. It's patients. They're not using homeopathy or alternative therapies, as far as I know, or herbal remedies, which have a 2,000-year history. They use conventional medications. That's what they do with Doctors Without Borders. So they've accepted the mainstream medical model that drugs are best, nutrition cannot be useful to treat disease. So just because they have good motivation doesn't mean they haven't accepted the standard medical model. I think most doctors, as we began this discussion, have accepted the mainstream medical model that nutrition is worthless, can't possibly be useful, that anyone who believes that is crazy, a quack, a fraud, all that stuff, and that only drugs and those kind of interventions can be useful to treat disease. And they accept that as a reigning model in medicine, though it is beginning to change. And we've seen a change in our own lifetime. I mean, you said wealthy people. We have wealthy people as patients. We have wealthy people that have donated us money. That's one reason we can pay for some of these charity patients.
Have you ever been called a quack by the medical community? And if so, what was your reaction to it?
I think bigotry is unfortunate, whether you're dealing with racial bigotry, ethnic bigotry, or scientific bigotry. Calling people names is never a productive approach, whatever the field, be it medicine, philosophy, religion, psychology. So I always find it sad that there are physicians who have some kind of character flaw that they feel I have to call other physicians doing something different names. The way I approach that, I just ignore it. My successful patients speak for themselves. Having been trained to do bone marrow transplantation, I don't have to do this to make a living. If I wanted to make money, bone marrow transplant is $500,000 million a shot. It's a good way to make a lot of money. I do it because it works. And when patients I don't care what anyone says. I once said, which annoyed all my critics, I think of my critics as mosquitoes, kind of buzzing around my ear and just swat them away and they go disappear. I don't take them too seriously. When they can match my cases, I'll be happy to take them seriously. But I just don't take them very seriously. And we'll keep doing our work because the patients keep getting well.
A question on the dark side. I want to talk a little bit about Julianne Charelle, who said went blind and died during the Gonzalez Regimen.
That's totally incorrect.
Okay, I'm going to finish it. I want you to tell me what is correct. There was a publicized lawsuit initiated by her widow, and then he acquired $2 million from the suit. Tell me what's right. Tell me what's wrong.
Well, virtually everything you said was wrong. First, Julianne Charelle first contacted my office in March of 1991. She had a 6-month history of vaginal bleeding. And we were astonished she hadn't seen a doctor, and I refused to see her. She wanted to see me. She was interested in alternative medicine. I gave her the phone number of a gynecologist. She called a month later in April saying she wanted to set up an appointment, I guess assuming that we didn't realize she had called us. We said no. I gave her the phone number of my colleague from Cornell who was a gynecologist. Finally, in September, she sees the gynecologist 6 months after she first contacted my office. He did a biopsy. She had the most aggressive type of uterine cancer there was and wanted to do a hysterectomy. So she calls me again and says, I want to come see you. Now, we've learned a patient like that we would never accept today because she wasn't making good decisions. We insisted she get surgery. She went and had a hysterectomy. The CAT scan showed it had already metastasized. After she had surgery, she met with Dr. Dettino, her gynecological oncologist, who said, you have the worst. She had 3 kinds of endometrial cancer: clear cell, papillary serous, poorly differentiated, none of which respond to chemotherapy, none of which respond to radiation. The only controlled study ever done was done by Dr. Alders in 1980, in which he found patients with her type of endometrial cancer that get radiation live less long and have greater instances of metastases than the women that just have surgery.
So there was no lawsuit?
There was a lawsuit.
There was a lawsuit.
I'll get to the lawsuit. Okay. So Dr. Dettino wanted to put her on an experimental chemotherapy protocol, which incidentally he never published because apparently everyone died. At that point, we agreed to accept her as a patient. We took her as a patient, knowing she had metastatic disease. 9 months later, she had some bone pain. She ended up with an orthopedist at Mount Sinai. They did a CAT scan. They saw a tumor in the spine, which I think had been there from the original CAT scan. Undergoes surgery. They pull out a dead tumor. I have the pathology report. It was a dead tumor. Dr. Holland, who was chief of oncology and for some reason hated me, said, Gonzalez is a fraud and a quack. I'm going to help you get you a lawyer. You'll sue him. They decide to give her chemo, even though there's no evidence chemo works. While getting chemo, she starts having side effects, ends up going blind months after she starts seeing me. It drives me nuts when people say she went blind under my care. She went blind under the care of Dr. Holland at Mount Sinai, who very astutely got her the great, trial lawyers in New York, and I'm an alternative doctor, and they sued me. And they did win. Now, Julian Charelle did not die until 2010. I have the notes from Mount Sinai from 1992 that said she had 12 to 24 months to live. She lasted 18 years. Actually, she's a reportable case because I know of no patient with metastatic endometrial cancer with the 3 histologies that she had that survived 18 years. I know of no case in history of medicine. Chemotherapy is worthless. She went blind while she was receiving conventional medication, even though the data shows that what she received doesn't work for her disease. So they were very astute, and the medical community organized because they figured this is 1992. I was already getting too well known. They knocked me down a peg. The lawyer was assigned by my insurance carrier, did absolutely nothing to defend. We had Pierre Guessery, former medical director of the Pasteur Institute, willing to come in. He didn't call him as a witness. We had the medical director of Procter & Gamble willing to come in. They didn't call him. They called no witnesses in my defense. I sued the insurance company, my malpractice carrier. I sued the lawyer that didn't defend me properly.
Did you win?
They settled for an enormous amount of money.
So you won that case?
Well, they settled, so we can't say we won. Let's say they made me very happy after trying to block the case for years.
Okay. So is there a conspiracy? Because
so that's a long answer to your question. People bring it up.
Long answers I love. Is there a conspiracy? Because one of my producers said, as a result, is this true or not? Did you have to undergo psychological examination and the New York State Medical Board put you on 2 years probation? Is that also not true?
That's true, but what happened with
Why?
that? The people that were involved in that lawsuit filed complaints with the medical board. There was the so-called Quackbuster group, whose goal is to get rid of alternative medicine, filed a complaint, and they're required to go up to Syracuse, where the medical board conducts 4-day evaluations of physicians. They conducted a 4-day evaluation. Joe Grant was the PhD in charge of the medical board investigative team. At the end of 4 days, he comes he calls me into his office, shuts his door, throws a temper tantrum and said, "You absolutely don't belong here. This is political. This is horrific. You're one of the most qualified doctors I've ever met." The medical board then, I guess they were frustrated they didn't get what they wanted, sent Julian Hyman, who actually was involved with eventually became involved with the pilot study, as to oversee my practice for a year. Now, Julian Hyman's brother was an oncologist professor at Columbia. Julian's one of the most esteemed, now retired, esteemed oncologists in New York. His son, Stephen, was director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, a Harvard-trained research psychiatrist. After leaving the National Institutes of Mental Health, he became provost of Harvard University, second in command. He's Julian's family is an impeccably trained, well-known medical family. Julian came in, sent from the medical board, as he said, and I have an affidavit that he signed and notarized that he saw miracles in my practice. He became one of my best friends. The guy they sent from the medical board to screw me became one of my best friends, and we're going to have dinner in a couple of weeks again. He and his girlfriend and my wife and I have dinner with him.
And that's a hell of a way of collecting friends. Just everyone who screws you, just make friends with them. Have you ever treated anyone in your family?
No.
Has anyone in your family have had cancer?
My father died of esophageal cancer when I was a medical student before I was in practice.
Have you applied for FDA approval on your treatment?
We've approached, the FDA had to approve our second clinical study because it was a federally funded government study, and the FDA has to approve all government studies, and they did. They gave us approval to do the study. And in that study, although I gave the negative components, the longer survivors when the study completed were actually our patients, even though most of them were so sick they couldn't do the therapy. So we actually approached the FDA, and the FDA said they don't approve complex dietary regimens. They only approve drugs, so I'm not within their jurisdiction, actually. So that was the answer. We did approach them, but they said they don't approve complex dietary, or they don't approve them or disapprove them. It's not something.
Do you find that, as a rule, alternative doctors are sued at a greater frequency than traditional doctors?
I find that they're sued less. And we've learned over the years. We had 2 lawsuits from the early 90s during a period when I wasn't using an informed consent at the recommendation of a lawyer who was subsequently disbarred. We have an airtight consent form where patients know this is alternative. They can't claim as the Charelle family, we didn't know it was alternative. We have an airtight consent form and not had a problem since. Conventional doctors are sued all the time. I just got a request for records. A patient had contacted us wanting to do the therapy with pancreatic cancer, but she was too late, so we turned her down. But she's now suing Columbia, including one of Dr. Chabot's colleagues. We get that all the time where patients of ours are suing conventional doctors. I have a patient whose husband went to Sloan Kettering with a simple problem, ended up a vegetable. She sued Sloan Kettering for millions of dollars, which they settled. and she's a multimillionaire now. Her husband died eventually, but it was a terrible story. So I have a patient whose husband makes his living suing Johns Hopkins. So conventional doctors are sued all the time. The thing is, they have lots of money. Columbia has a $150 million slush fund, and they just pay off the lawsuits, so they never make the press, and you don't go on the internet or see them.
Why are there not universities that actually dedicate themselves to this regimen, considering of what its track record is?
When I met Kelly, I went through his records, and there were patients who got well, and that's all I needed to know. I didn't care what it meant to me professionally. I had to make extraordinary professional decisions. I had 2 offers for jobs at Sloan Kettering, which I had to turn down because I would have had to give up my controversial research. You just have to make a choice based on what is scientifically truthful, what is best for the patients. And I guess a lot of my colleagues don't seem to approach things that way. All they have to do is come to my office, go as Julian Hyman, sent from the medical board, did, went through my records, said, "This is remarkable." He said, as he said in his signed affidavit, "These are miracles." I don't know why university. I worked with Columbia for 8 years. Why didn't they accept it? One of the most eminent academic institutions in the world. They seemed to have done everything they could to make sure my therapy wouldn't look good. I don't know why they did that.
We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you a question. If Steve Jobs went to you at the very beginning and followed your regimen, do you think he'd be alive?
Well, all I can say is I have a patient with exactly the same kind of cancer that came to me in 1996, stage 4 metastases in the liver, diagnosed at the Mayo Clinic with islet cell, exactly the same histological diagnosis as Jobs. And 16 years later, he's alive and well, and the cancer's completely gone just on our regimen. It was too advanced, never had surgery. It was confirmed at the Mayo Clinic, and he's doing great. Now, Steve Jobs did call me about 2 years before he died. We spoke for about 45 minutes, never did the therapy, never came to see me, never heard from him again. His acupuncturist was a great advocate, but he decided he wouldn't do it. And I could tell talking to him that first he was obviously very smart. He thought he was a lot, smarter than anyone else, which he probably was. But managing your own medical case when you're not a physician is a really dangerous thing to do. But that's what he was doing. He was essentially going his own way. So we talked, but never did the therapy, and he died. Whether I could have reversed it, all I can say is we have patients with advanced islet cell carcinoma have been with me 16 years, have done beautifully. So I think it would have given him a better chance than doing what he tried to do on his own.
What does it normally cost for a person who has different types of cancer to actually, out of their own pocket, pay for this type of treatment?
Well, the first year is the most expensive because a lot of initial evaluation and fees and just doing the evaluation costs about $10,000 to $12,000 for the first year. That includes the supplements and everything. Then it's each year it's much less than that. It may average about $6,000 or $7,000 a year after that. The first year is the most.
Actually, that's not bad at all.
Well, compared to chemo, which can cost bone reconstruction can cost $500,000 for one shot.
Dr. Gonzalez, in fact, it's been an absolute pleasure. If you'd like to meet with Dr. Gonzalez, please go to his website at www.dr/gonzalez.com, or you could call him at 212-213-3337. His latest book is entitled What Went Wrong? Exploring the Mismanagement of the Only Negative Study Done on His Treatment. If you'd like to order it, you could go to drgonzalez.com or you could go to Amazon. I am Dr. Errol Gluck. Remember, to every problem, there is a solution. I am your problem solver. Please go to our website, www.glucksolutions.org, or call my office at 212-599-3195. This is gluckradio.com. Till next time.